We'll get started. We'll see who might trickle in. So we have a lot to talk about today. So the syllabus, and just look ahead to how we're going to finish out the course after Lukacs, namely Adorno. We'll be doing Adorno for a while. So we're going to start off nice and easy, do lyric poetry and society. You see that there are some other readings, specifically the Marcuse, Note on Dialectic. And then we will have another literary example. We haven't, for reasons of time, done very much justice to our literary examples so far, but maybe we will next time. So Paul Celan, who's a contemporary of Adorno's, and who is someone that Adorno is going to reference in aesthetic theory. So the contemporary artists that Adorno will raise in aesthetic theory are, again, literary in nature. Samuel Beckett and Paul Celan will be important sort of touchstones. But this week with Lukacs, in anticipation of getting into Adorno next time, we're going to start to introduce Marxism, even though we are reading Lukacs before he was a Marxist. So Lukacs is sort of famous for his Marxist works, but he was also pretty prominent in his own time before he converted to Marxism as a literary critic, as a writer. But nonetheless, there will be, even though we're dealing with Lukacs and the theory of the novel, before he turns to Marxism as a result of the Russian Revolution in 1917. Still, there are going to be some abiding themes. So we're going to have to revisit modernity, the question of modernity again, but now start to introduce a kind of Marxist concept of modernity. Now, also in anticipation of next time, Adorno's Lyric Poetry and Society is in part inspired by Lukacs. So Lukacs does have, as a counterexample to the novel, lyric poetry. And so Adorno takes a kind of point of departure or a cue from Lukacs and writes his essay on lyric poetry and society as a further elaboration of what Lukacs says in the theory of the novel about lyric poetry. And then after that, we'll start getting into aesthetic theory. Now, you'll notice that during Critique Week, I have asked to do my critique panel on a different day than my class days, so that we could have an optional class session on Friday of that week, if you guys are available, again, optional, where we can get into a concrete example in the midst of our reading of aesthetic theory with Adorno on music in his own time. And that's foreign informal music. Yeah, so that's what the rest of the course is going to look like. It's going to be Adorno starting next time, and then for the rest of the course, 3 sessions on aesthetic theory. We're not reading all of aesthetic theory. We're reading certain key parts of it. We're reading a lot of it, most of it, I think. We'll concentrate on certain select portions of it. So Adorno, like Nietzsche and Kant, is one of our multi-week thinkers, and we will be culminating. So Adorno will be referencing all the readings that we've done up to this point, plus some others that we have not. So Marxism is one thing that he's going to reference. The other is Freudian psychoanalysis, and we'll deal with that as we need to, but it's not going to be a very strong theme. So hopefully we won't be too put off by not having that included in the course. So anyone like to volunteer to hazard some notes in the discussion thread for next time, Adorno's Lyric Poetry and Society? Okay, good. Okay, good. So you guys coordinate? Great. Excellent. Thank you. All right, so some historical background on Lukacs. We've covered some of this history already. But I want to bring us up into the 20th century now. Sorry, this board is a little bit messy. Well, let's use it. So I think previously we've looked at a timeline of the 1800s, the 19th century, and we've only gotten up to World War I as a kind of a bookend on the period. Of what I called high modernism. Which is the period in which Nietzsche was writing. So modernism, in this view, in the way that modernism is understood by the writers we're considering in the course, originates from the middle of the 19th century, circa 1848, circa the revolutions of 1848. High modernism is the period of the Belle Epoque, as it's called in France, or the Gilded Age, as it's called in the United States and in the English-speaking world more generally. This is the period of the Second Industrial Revolution. So if the Industrial Revolution, from a Marxist perspective, we'll see, brought about capitalism, 1750 to 1850, first in England and then on the continent after the French Revolution. Then high modernism is associated with the Second Industrial Revolution. So if the first Industrial Revolution was centered first in England and then in France and in what's known as the Benelux countries, so Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, so Western Europe, Northwestern Europe. The Second Industrial Revolution has a different locus, namely Germany and Japan and the United States. Also, in a more subordinate way, Italy and Russia. Russia was not what Russia is now. Russia was the Russian Empire. It included a lot of Poland, it included the Baltic states. And the western part of the Russian Empire was the area where a lot of industrialization took place. But again, Russia and Italy are more subordinate zones of new industrialization. The main countries are Germany, Japan, and the US. Another subordinate zone, actually two, for Germany are the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. They are the client states of Germany, of the Prussian Empire, and they're the allies of Germany in World War I. So they're what's known as the Central Powers in World War I. So the countries that lose the war in World War I all experience revolutions. So Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire all collapse as a function of World War I, so does Russia. Italy changed sides. So originally Italy was supposed to be with Austria-Hungary and Prussia and the Ottomans, but then they, right before the war, they switched sides because they have their own beef with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Trieste. But they failed to achieve their war aims. And so they also experience a crisis at the end of World War I. So in Russia, of course, it brings about the Russian Revolution. But there's also something that tends to be forgotten, the German Revolution in 1918. So the Russian Revolution in 1917, German Revolution in 1918 into 1919. There's also a crisis in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There's an uprising in Vienna. There's also an uprising in Hungary. Lukacs, our author, is Hungarian, and he participates in what's known as the Hungarian Soviet Republic, or the Hungarian Workers' Council Republic, as like a commissar of culture in 1919, in a brief revolutionary government that takes place in Hungary before it's suppressed. Japan and the United States are on the winning side of World War I. The Ottoman Empire has a Turkish nationalist uprising, also is broken up as a losing power. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire is broken up. The Russian Empire is broken up, although a lot of it ends up in the Soviet Union. The Ottoman Empire is broken up and taken over as protectorates by the French and the British as the winning side of World War I. Famously, infamously, Saudi Arabia gets independence in the revolt against the Ottomans. It was a kind of Arabian revolt. But Palestine, the Transjordan, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria are mandates of the British and the French. Egypt had already become independent of the Ottomans and had an independent kingdom before World War I. All right. Marxism. So this is the period of the Second Industrial Revolution. It's also the period of Marxism, as opposed to Marx. Marx being a figure of 1848. Marx, like Richard Wagner and Charles Baudelaire, are 48ers. They're red 48ers or revolutionary 48ers or something or other. Baudelaire is a highly ambiguous figure. Wagner is a radical in 1848. So the difference between Marx and Marxism is best understood as marking a historical shift. So Marx and his comrade, colleague, friend, buddy Engels, wingman Engels, they didn't invent socialism or communism. They're kind of minor figures. They're kind of radical Hegelian intellectuals in the midst of a larger socialist and communist movement that predates them. And so there is no like Marxism as like a political force until much later, until this period of the Second Industrial Revolution. That's when you have the growth of mass socialist parties that come under more or less the ideological leadership of Marxism. So I mentioned Lukacs was not a Marxist before the Russian Revolution. Marxism has a huge presence in the German-speaking world, Germany, Austria, Hungary, because the largest party is in Germany. The largest Marxist-led party is in Germany. Although Marxism has an influence in the United States, there's a socialist party here that's very much influenced by Marxism. The French are more heterodox, as are the English. So there's the English Social Democratic Federation, there's a French Socialist Party. They are also influenced by Marxism, but more heterodox. Italy and Russia have Marxist parties. So of course the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, one faction of it, the Bolsheviks, take power in the Russian Revolution. In Italy, one of the leaders of the Italian Socialist Party, Benito Mussolini, invents a new ideology because he thinks Marxism is not radical enough. So he's someone who had collaborated with Lenin in the Marxist movement before World War I. also with Rosa Luxemburg, who's a major figure in the German Social Democratic Party before World War I. So he's a radical Marxist socialist, Mussolini, but he decides Marxism is not radical enough, so he invents a new ideology, and that's fascism. So I point that out because when Marxism had a major influence in the advanced capitalist world, in the metropolitan countries, during the period of the Second Industrial Revolution, there is a kind of non-Marxist, anti-Marxist, even post-Marxist consciousness, we might say, or there are rival theories about capitalism and socialism. So there are people who are very Marxisant, who are very much aware of Marxism, but who reject it politically. Lukacs is one of those people. So Lukacs is in a circle of intellectuals around the German sociologist Max Weber. And Max Weber was the first academic professor to teach Marx in the academic classroom. So very influenced by Marx, but also very hostile to Marxism as a political movement, which was seen as kind of demagogical, vulgar, and also complicit in the very problem that it was trying to address, namely complicit in capitalist modernity. Right, so people like Max Weber, but also Lukacs before he converted to Marxism, would have thought of Marxism as an ideology in the working class that was simply affirming capitalist industrial development with all of the problems in society and culture that come with it. Right, so again, Lukacs would have considered himself to be interested in a more radical critique of modernity than Marxism could offer, because Marxism was seen as just trying to do an economic redistribution within a capitalist, essentially capitalist framework, and calling it socialism, but that's how they saw it. They saw socialism as a kind of ultra-capitalism, as a kind of egalitarian, radical, kind of worker redistributionist form of capitalism, and avoiding the deeper issue of what Nietzsche called attention to, namely the nihilism of modernity, the nihilism of capitalist modernity. I mention this because Nietzsche is sort of hovering in the background with Lukacs. We'll see brought out more explicitly by Adorno. And Weber was someone who was influenced not only by Marx, but also by Nietzsche. Weber is extremely Nietzschean. And traces capitalist modernity, the problem of capitalism, to a theological problem in Christianity, in Protestant Christianity. Right, so he wrote a famous book, Max Weber, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, in which Weber concluded that the Protestant work ethic had an inevitable nihilistic endpoint. He said capitalism will continue, Max Weber, capitalism will continue until the last ton of fossil fuel is burnt up. In other words, modern society and capitalism is just on this accelerating, it's just barreling down this accelerating highway of just productive activity, and it's fueled by fossil fuels, and it's just going to keep going until the fuel runs out. Right, and that the socialists, the Marxists, as a political movement, have nothing to offer except getting the workers on board with that. So again, Lukacs would have seen his view of modernity as more radical in nature, precisely because it's more cultural in character. In other words, it's more kind of global, encompassing. It's not just an economic gripe of the workers being exploited under capitalism. All of that is important because, again, in the background of the text is this question of bourgeois society and modernity. So bourgeois society, something coming out of the Renaissance, so the birth of the novel form, the aesthetic form of the novel, as having its origins in the origins of bourgeois society in the Renaissance. Why Dante why Dante's Inferno is the first novel, which is a very peculiar way of putting things. Although there are antecedents, of course, before that, but that's like a clear historical marker for him. And other kind of what we would now call early modern, like Cervantes, Don Quixote. The birth of the novel in bourgeois society. He's not going to really be talking about socioeconomic things, though, when you read the novel, but it is in the background. Like I said, he is aware of this. He's aware of an account of history that would prioritize the socioeconomic character of the changes with modernity. But he's focused on one thing. This is an essay, a historico-philosophical essay. And the reason that I say this is that Marxism can be misconstrued as, Marxism is usually what people say that it is. It's, most varieties of Marxism are like economic determinist or class reductionist. In other words, that Marxism is seen as a socioeconomic analysis of things like art and culture. But in fact, we will see Adorno next time, but also starting now with Lukacs. What would it mean to approach modernity through a different axis? In other words, rather than looking at one axis of society and history, the economic axis or the socioeconomic axis, what if you were to do the history of modernity through other kinds of phenomena? Right? Can you tell the history of modernity through the novel form, as opposed to through the history of capitalism? And then there are other ways of thinking about it. You could do it as political history. You could do it as the rise of the modern republic, from the Renaissance city-states all the way up through the revolutions of the 17th and 18th century, the Dutch Revolt, the English Civil War, the American and French revolutions. Right, so there are different ways of looking at modernity. You could tell a political history, you could tell an economic history, you could tell a kind of socioeconomic or sociological history, or you could tell a art history or a literary history. You could. Now, I say this because Marx himself, early on in the 1840s as a young man, said to one of his colleagues, he said, one could begin anywhere. One could begin with the critique of religion. Oh, that's the other point. So you could tell it as religious history. You could tell it as a crisis and transformation of a religious cosmology, the Protestant Reformation, the transformation of Christianity from traditional Catholic Christianity to modern Protestant Christianity. So Marx said you could start anywhere. You could start with religion. You could start with philosophy. You could start with...
I think I left
You could tell it through, again, political history. You could do it through political economy, a kind of social history of the economy. It doesn't matter where you begin. You could do a critique from any angle of the society. So why did Marxism go the economic route or the political economic route? Why is it associated with that? Well, because in the 19th century, the mass movement that existed, the phenomenon that existed independently of Marxism, was a mass political and social movement of the industrial working class, calling for socialism, calling to abolish bourgeois private property in capital, private property in the means of production as owned by the capital investors, that class of people. So that existed, and Marx just took that as his point of departure because that was the movement that looked like it was going to change the world in his time and also beyond his time, also in the time of Lukacs. So I mentioned that Lukacs converts to Marxism in the context of the Russian Revolution and the other events in the wake of World War I, because he sees it as more radical than he originally estimated. And there is a political avant-garde as a phenomenon that is accompanied by an artistic and cultural avant-garde. So there is an explosion of a cultural and artistic and literary avant-garde also around World War I and in the aftermath, and participating in the revolutionary movements of the time. So famously, Futurism gets on board with fascism in Italy. Russian futurists get on board with Bolshevism. And there are constructivists and others. Right? So a high modernism also takes a certain turn around World War I and the revolutions that follow. So again, in this period leading up to World War I, the question is, what kind of discontents are bubbling up? And maybe the discontent with modernity can be seen in other domains, not only in the mass movement of the industrial working class, making certain economic, social, and political demands. Maybe it can also be seen in bourgeois high culture. Right, so we'll see the trajectory that Lukacs takes in the theory of the novel. He starts with the Renaissance, and he ends with a kind of culmination. And it's a kind of a twofold culmination. It's Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. And he regards Tolstoy as reaching the outer limits of the novel form, and Dostoevsky is already beyond the novel form. Now, I mentioned that Nietzsche is lurking in the background. Dostoevsky is very important for Nietzsche too, in fact, or for the late Nietzsche. So Tolstoy is in a different way, but anyway, Russian modernism, we could say, kind of Russian modernist novel, or a kind of explosion of the novel form at the end of the 19th century. Now, if the novel started in the Renaissance, it reaches a certain culmination in the period that we've considered previously, namely the period of the late 18th and early 19th century. So basically the latter part of the 1700s, early part of the 1800s, really culminating in certain respects around Romanticism and realism. Goethe, a very important figure. Goethe is a very important figure. And I want to say something about this. The Bildungsroman as a kind of paradigmatic form of the novel, anticipated a little bit earlier in England, in the English novel, in the novels of Defoe, for example, like Robinson Crusoe and Moll Flanders. But the Bildungsroman, I think Goethe's novel, The Apprenticeship of Wilhelm Meister. So the Bildungsroman, the story of how the protagonist became who he or she is. Right, that focus of the novel. There is some reference to this. James Joyce, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Right, as a sort of high modernist expression, Joyce. And we had also a variety of this in the Wordsworth. So Wordsworth, his prelude is an autobiography in verse. That's a kind of epic poem, autobiography. That's essentially the story of how he became who he was as both a person and as a writer. Right, so it's the story of the constitution of his character, but also of his consciousness, his subjectivity, right, in multiple domains. So as a part of society, but also aesthetically, psychologically, right, a certain kind of psychological crystallization, maturation. The Sentimental Education is another important novel of the realist vein. I'll also point in the early 19th century, Dickens and Balzac. Also Stendhal, who we didn't talk about this we should have, but I'll just mention this. So when Nietzsche, in the third essay On the Genealogy of Morals a couple of weeks ago, goes after Kant for disinterested beauty, right? He brings up, Stendhal brings up, is beauty disinterested, or rather is it the promise of happiness? Is beauty the promise of happiness rather than a disinterestedness? You guys got my thing from last week, the theologico-political fragment? Okay, good. Right, redemption, that's the one thing that, again, we're missing our crucial, since they changed our schedule, 15 minutes. But we would need a little bit more time than that. But anyway, that concept, so redemption, freedom, and happiness, those concepts, in Nietzsche's Case of Wagner and in Adorno's Fantasia Sopra Carmen. So the novel as a story of the pursuit of happiness, the novel as a story of the pursuit of freedom, the novel as the realization of the individual, the story of the realization of the individual. And perhaps in that sense, a redemption of the individual. A redemption of the individual. But what is this individual? What is this individual? Right, so that's what we have to keep in mind. So if the novel is based on the individual in a way that the preceding narrative art form, the epic, was not, well, there are other parallel phenomena, also originating in the Renaissance and culminating in the late 18th and early 19th century, in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Next time we'll deal with lyric poetry in society. So we'll take up lyric poetry, although we will also talk about lyric poetry a bit today. We might carry over some of that discussion into our discussion of Adorno's essay next week. So the lyric poem as opposed to the epic poem. It's a good little illustration. So the lyric is literally the song of the individual. It's the individual voice, as opposed to the epic poem, which is more the voice of the community. Similarly, epic narrative is the story of the tribe. It's the oral history. It's literature's origins and religion. It's not the story of individuals, it's the story of the community. It's the story of really the cosmological community. That's why literature has its origin in religion and scripture. So the epic form is a more collective form. The novel, like the lyric poem, is a more individual form, meaning it's about individual subjectivity, the protagonist, but it's about individual characters, but it's also about the individual subject in terms of the reader or the viewer. In visual art, which I know is going begging in this course, in visual art we have, in painting, we have the two major genres of painting, history painting and the easel painting. History painting and the easel painting. So easel painting as opposed to the history painting. So the history painting as the more public, right? So installed in a particular architectural space, usually a kind of a public space, although it predates, of course, our notion of the public. Religious art in the church, but also art in the Lord's castle, right? History painting, which is meant for a collective viewership. And even while it's about characters, those characters are stand-ins for the community. They're exemplars of the community. They're not individuals as such. So history painting, easel painting. So why is an easel painting an easel painting? It's transportable. It's painted on the easel. It's also perhaps, it's mounted, it's portable, it might even be displayed on the easel. It has a different kind of, what is it that we have in the horrible software universe? Portrait and landscape, right? So the portrait is one thing, the landscape is the other thing. That tells us something. Of course, the three major genres of the easel painting are indeed landscape, the still life, and the portrait. So the novel form emerges out of the epic narrative form. Lyric poetry emerges, and again, way back in the ancient times, but very prominently in the bourgeois era, out of the epic poem. The easel painting not only emerges out of history painting, but indeed dominates visual art, meaning almost no one does history painting. There are people who are known for being muralists, but basically painting becomes easel painting in the way that poetry becomes lyric poetry. Almost nobody writes epic poetry anymore. Right? And again, there isn't really epic literature. There are novels. When people do try to write epics, we still read them as if they're novels. When people paint history paintings, we still look at them as if they're easel paintings. When we read epic poetry, we read it as lyric poetry. Right, so the emergence of this kind of novel narrative art form, lyric poetry, the predominance of easel painting. So what characterizes these things? Again, the individual subject. First and foremost, the individual subject of experience, namely of the viewing, the reading. Also, we could say listening. Listening in music. How are we listening? Are we listening collectively or are we listening individually? That issue, which we'll come back to. So it thematizes the individual. The novel, unlike the epic, is based on realism, but a certain kind of realism, a psychological realism. Psychological realism that corresponds to three different subjectivities. The subjectivity of the protagonist, the subjectivity of the author, the authorial voice of the narrative itself, and the subjectivity of the reader. Excuse me. The subjectivity in these three different dimensions we relate to at the level of psychological reality, or realism as a criterion that we measure psychologically. Right? That's why it can be fantastical, or it can be science fiction, but we're still dealing with the subject matter, we're still dealing with the characters, we're still having a reading experience, and we're relating to the narration as a real individual subject. One last thing that I'll say about this is the tragedy. So birth of tragedy, death of tragedy, rebirth of tragedy, Nietzsche. The principium individuationis in the birth of tragedy, meaning the constitution of the individual through the work of art, meaning that the work of art instantiates the individual subjectivity of the artist, of the viewer, maybe of the subject of the art. Although, again, that would be in relation to both the artist and the viewer. And the contradiction that Nietzsche posed between the Apollonian and the Dionysian, meaning that the Apollonian is about constituting the individual, and the Dionysian is about the dissolution of the individual. So losing yourself in the artwork, the Dionysian moment, finding yourself in the artwork, the Apollonian moment. So again, the novel form as a story of a character, a protagonist, who finds his or herself. The reading experience, the reader finding something of themselves through that story, of the protagonist finding themselves. But also the author, the authorial voice, the narrative itself having that character. Right? That the narrative itself is about discovering, constituting, achieving a kind of subjectivity. Right? That gives you the contours of the novel. Where does the novel begin? How does it develop? How does it end? What is the shape of the novel? It all hinges on this, on a transformative moment in which the individual comes into being. So what we've talked about, that being and becoming, the dialectic of being and becoming, the novel is about both. Becoming who one is. By the way, Nietzsche also wrote about that, so he's got other writings, and so he also wrote about how he became himself, how he found himself. Zarathustra was really about that, which he considered his sort of quintessential work. Zarathustra's kind of a mess. But anyway, he thought that it was his greatest achievement. All right, so now we also touched on, if you recall, the Old Testament and the New Testament as literature. Remember what Nietzsche said about that? He said, the Old Testament is a good book, the New Testament is a trashy book. What do you mean? What do you mean? The Old Testament's an epic. The New Testament is a novel. It's the story of Jesus. The Old Testament is the story of the tribe. The New Testament is the story of Jesus. So there's that. It's a kind of a bad book that ruins the Bible at a literary level. Right? So if it was just the Old Testament, it would be great, according to Nietzsche. But then they had to tack on this trashy novel, the New Testament. The story of Jesus. Now, of course, he's funny. He's funny. Also, is the New Testament a tragedy? Is it a tragedy? Right? Is Jesus a tragic figure? Is he a Dionysian figure? Is he a Dionysian figure? Is he a sacrificial figure, of course? Right? So is it a tragedy, or is it a comedy? Or is it a comedy? That would be the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism. So you guys have seen the phrase, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus do, children? Right, that's a Protestant sentiment. Catholics don't ask that question because Jesus is Christ. You're not going to do what Jesus did. It's just understood. Jesus is not a role model. No. It's our inability to be like Jesus that is the point of Christianity originally. Protestantism, though. Protestantism, what would Jesus do? So Protestantism makes Jesus into a bourgeois individual that we can relate to, and we can say, be like Jesus, right? No, that's blasphemy. That's why the Catholic Church spent over 100 years and killing millions of people trying to put it down. Because Protestantism is a destruction of Christianity. It's the transformation of Christianity, of course, but it's the destruction of Christianity in Nietzsche's view. I'm channeling Nietzsche now. Because it is the ruining of tragedy and its replacement by comedy. Meaning it becomes a different kind of allegory. It becomes an allegory of not cosmic meaning, but of society. Right? It becomes an allegory of social reality. Right? So the rapture, right? We're thinking about okay, which people are going to be taken up in the rapture and which ones are going to be left behind. Right? It becomes a story of our kind of empirical social reality. Right. It's a bizarre. Anyway, this is Nietzsche. Right? I'm channeling Nietzsche here, and of course he's saying that in order to, really shock his readers, but also to raise certain questions. In other words, could the original meaning of Christianity survive bourgeois modernity? No, it can't. And yet, bourgeois modernity was somehow necessary. In other words, it is a necessary self-overcoming of Christianity. So then what does it amount to? What does it amount to? Right. So, if you remember, Nietzsche said, it's a problem. Modernity is a problem. The modern circumstance is one of a problem. Nihilism. Nihilism is a symptom of a problem. Right? A hitherto unknown problem and a new problem, but that nonetheless we have to go through. The forms of great epic literature examine in relation to whether the general civilization of the time is an integrated or a problematic one. Right. So, two frameworks. One is, again, the epic is an integrated civilization. It's the product of an integrated civilization. It's the product of a civilization before it becomes problematical. Insofar as the bourgeois novel has ancient antecedents, it stems from literature that come at the end of classical civilization, that come at the end of Greek and at the end of Roman civilization. Right. Not only the novel, but the philosophy that we take from classical antiquity, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Also the late philosophy of the Roman era, the Stoicism of the Roman era. Also the art forms, though. Right? So the art forms, tragedy translating into comedy. Also lyricism. So insofar as there is an antecedent, it's when those ancient civilizations became problematical that they gave rise to the forms of art and literature that we most readily relate to. We don't actually relate to tragedy in its original form, for example. So, problematic one, well, it's not just any civilization rendered problematical, it's this civilization, it's Western civilization, it's bourgeois civilization. Now, problematical, again, two ways of thinking about it. Christianity came out of the crisis of classical antiquity. Christianity came out of that too. It was the product of that ancient Mediterranean civilization becoming problematical. It gave rise to a different kind of integrated civilization, medieval Christendom, which again entered into its own problematic phase, namely the Renaissance and the bourgeois era, or modernity. But then modernity has two phases. Modernity has a kind of an integrated phase, namely early modernity versus late modernity, bourgeois modernity versus capitalist modernity, right? The modernity of the 19th century, which has become problematic in a new way. The novel form as the expression of a problematic civilization, but again in two ways, meaning it does emerge with the Renaissance and achieves a certain flowering at the end of the 1700s and the early 1800s. But then the novel form itself becomes problematical in the late 1800s and the late 19th century. And of course, that's the era of capitalism. High modernism.
There's an argument about Goethe's Wilhelmmeister is that it's almost integrated.
Yep.
It's educated in that way.
Right.
Between the interiority and exteriority.
Right. Another term besides integration would be reconciliation. Right. In other words, problematical would mean unreconciled, integrated would mean reconciled. So one way of thinking about it, again, to use, because I've been leaning on the Nietzschean stuff, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, right? The idea that Nietzsche has is that actually in tragedy, the Apollonian and the Dionysian are integrated. They're reconciled. Right? So, in other words, it's not to say that an integrated civilization doesn't contain tensions and contradictions, but they're integrated. Yeah. Right? In other words, they're mutually constitutive. And so he thinks that the reason that we are unable to regard a classical tragedy as such in its actual form, why we would have a one-sided view of it, an Apollonian view of it, is because we can't see both sides of it, we can't reconcile or integrate the two sides of it. Now, I mentioned at the time Shakespeare, right, who also makes an appearance in Lukacs' theory of the novel. So Shakespeare as modern tragedy, and as tragedy and comedy at the same time. But again, it is a kind of a rebirth of tragedy in the high bourgeois moment. Why it becomes classical drama in the way that it does, Shakespeare, because Shakespeare is profoundly influential throughout the world, right? It's not only influential in what comes after in England, but it's sort of canonical. But again, it's sort of like, well, what is this about? Is it about like cosmological existential meaning? Is it about society? Is it a tragedy? Is it a comedy? You know, is it divine? Is it secular? It's both. It's both in an integrated and reconciled way. In a way that in the 19th century, in the 1800s, it's coming apart. Right, so there are many kind of parallel tracks here. It's important because otherwise it's going to seem like just a flat opposition. It's not a flat opposition. And it's also not just periods on a line of time historically. It's phases that recur. Right, again, the kind of birth, death, and rebirth of tragedy, to use Nietzsche's language. These are phases. In the same way, the modern novel, the novel that culminates in the late 18th and early 19th century, but then goes through a phase of dissolution in the 19th century that culminates right before Lukacs' writing with Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. What is it that Lukacs is after? So I should have told you guys, ignore the preface, because he has a later written, like, self-critical preface to this book that is not good, where he kind of disowns himself. But one of the things that he does raise in that preface is, well, what was he even trying to posit? What was he even trying to, get after? What was he trying to do with it? So his self-criticism, similar in some ways to Nietzsche's self-criticism of the birth of tragedy. Like, what was I even trying to do with this book? What is the point? Like, was I really saying that it all hinges on art and aesthetics, right? And what would that even mean, right? I mention that because I think that that preface that he wrote in the 60s is unfair to his work. And the reason that it's unfair to his work is that, in fact, it's not some kind of like category error, kind of misconstrual of things with the novel. It actually depends on the novel being two different things. So he distinguishes between the epic and the novel. So if the epic is the expression of integrated or reconciled, and the novel is the expression of the problematical, and therefore the unreconciled, or we could say the contradictory. Well, the epic is art. And he calls the novel half art. it's an interesting thing because, of course, the epic has its origins in religion. Or myth, which is what religion becomes in hindsight. So, how could it be that when epic narrative literature was all art, also it was religion? Whereas in fact, when it's half art, it's actually art, as opposed to religion. But then what is the other half? What is the non-art part of it? It's journalism. Right, so this is why it was so important for us to get into history at the end of last class, why I did the addendum that I did with Benjamin's theologico-political fragment. Because journalism refers to secular time and to history in that sense. Meaning, when we're reading a novel, we are reading like an aesthetic form, but we're also reading a document, an artifact, of a specific moment historically in secular time. Right? So we're getting a kind of a record of that historical time, as well as something that transcends its time, in terms of the form of narrative art, of literature. Right, so we're getting those two things. And in this respect, of course, the half-art character is, in fact, reconciled and integrated. But in a different way than the traditional epic form is. So what we really have through these categories of art, half art, non-art, what you have is the movement of a transformation of art. All right, so the movement of the self-transformation of a literary or artistic form takes the form of it going through a self-contradictory phase in which it becomes problematical, it becomes self-contradictory, it becomes unintegrated and unreconciled. So why all of this? So I mentioned Lukacs is not a Marxist yet. What is he? He's also not a Nietzschean, although he's aware of Nietzsche. He's in the Weber circle. Weber is influenced by Nietzsche as well as by Marx. He's a Hegelian. He's a neo-Hegelian. He's actually very self-consciously trying to do a Hegelian treatment of the novel form. And what that means is that something can be constituted through its contradiction.
Does he mention when does transformation happen? Is it is the characters within the novels, or is it who is there like a...
Oh, you mean in terms of the Bildungsroman?
Yeah.
It's the protagonist, right? It's the protagonist like becoming himself through a self-overcoming, a self-transformation.
Is there criteria to follow?
The other criteria? Well, each novel is treating it differently, right? But in terms of like the shape of the novel, the beginning, middle, end, as opposed to the epic, which is kind of one thing after another, right? And there is a kind of, yeah, I mean, again though, the epic is a kind of ambiguous, because it is art, it's also non-art, right? So, in other words, again, it starts out as non-art, becomes art. So let's think about it this way. We looked at the Raphael painting, right? which is the kind of one visual art reference that Nietzsche makes in The Birth of Tragedy. What is that? Is that a history painting? Is it an easel painting? What is that? Right? Is it religious art, or is it secular humanistic art? Right? Is he a Christian artist, or is he a Renaissance artist? A humanist artist? Well, of course he's both. So I mentioned that I saw the Raphael painting in the flesh, so to speak, at the Vatican Museum in Rome. Meaning, of course, the Vatican Museum, they collect other things. But I thought, oh yeah, it is going to be here, isn't it? Right? In other words, it's going to be appropriated by the church.
There's a set context for it to be, or context for it to be.
There is.
And
There
then
is.
Within it itself, within the agency that holds that.
Exactly. Exactly. So Raphael, is a Christian artist, right? It is, it's got Christian content. It is meant to be a worshipful, devotional, prayer, communing with divinity work of art. It's also supposed to be a humanistic work of art, right? So it sort of exemplifies that moment of the emergence of art from religion, right? Where, again, it's not like medieval Christian art, which in a sense really leans on religion for its meaning. It doesn't aim at a kind of self-contained aesthetic meaning that integrates its theological or divine meaning. But Raphael does that, we might say, although I had a debate once over Thanksgiving with a professor down at the University of Chicago, an older woman, and from Eastern Europe, and she was like, Raphael's trash. Raphael's trash. And I was like, okay, I guess so. Fine. Because she just thought it was too kitschy. It's too kitschy. And I just thought, Raphael's not my favorite, and Raphael's kitschy, and Raphael definitely circulates in the kitsch realm. If you go to a Christian bookstore or something, you'll probably find some Raphael reproductions, for sure, at the strip mall in the suburbs, definitely. Right? What is it? There's the Madonna. Does anyone know their Raphael? There's hold on, children, I'm sorry. There's the angels. You guys know the Raphael angels, right? Or is it not in Raphael? Do I always confuse Raphael and Botticelli? Oh no, it is. There you go. Children, have you seen this one? Okay, that's your Raphael. But there's also Raphael. There's a Madonna that I just had I saw reference to. Is it this one? This one. What was I reading? I was reading something. Someone was saying something snarky like, every petty bourgeois bedroom had this on the wall. Right? Meaning it's supposed to be a little bit sexy, a little bit not sexy, a little bit do your conjugal duty, father. Right? A little bit, Anyway, so yeah, sure, Raphael's kitsch. But again, Raphael is doing very religious content, but in a recognizably humanistic, it's recognizable as art. It's not like that weird medieval stuff.
Is it self-awareness and self-consciousness?
I don't know whether we would attribute that or not. What did Nietzsche say? He said he's naive, right? So in other words, it's a certain kind of subjectivity, it's a certain kind of consciousness. How self-conscious is it?
Yeah, how can it be, if it doesn't, the motivation and the intention is,
Motivation may not matter too much. It's the work. It is the work. Motivation may not be, because I mean, it's like, I don't know, Michelangelo or like,
Within
you
the
know.
context of it,
And again, we like parsing it. Is this like devotional religiosity? Is this like really like deeply Christian, or is it art? Like, is it the artist as the artist, or the artist as a Christian? How can you even separate them? You can't, right? I mean, I'll say that you know. So here's another thing, though, right? That is significant. So of course, the epic doesn't have an author. The novel has an author, right? You know, we know the painters who leave us some religious art we want to know, but then there's of course a lot of medieval art that we don't know, right? And it kind of doesn't matter, right? Suddenly it matters who the artist is. Right? So that's something too. Right? And then we ask these questions. We ask like psychobiographical questions. Like what we basically want is for there to be a novel about Raphael that informs us about his paintings. We can call that like research. We can call that like biography, right? We can call that like a Wikipedia page. But we're looking for a little novel that tells us the story of how did Raphael become the artist that he was, right? Written by the anonymous maoists on Wikipedia. Anyway, and it's
like the lives of the sorry book, but it's sort of like absurd. It's not super reliable information.
But it tells a good story.
Well, it talks about, it's like a book of biographies about Raphael, Michelangelo,
Titian.
maybe Giotto.
Giotto.
And it's like the lives of the most excellent painters, sculptors, and architects.
The most excellent children. You want people to write about you that way, yes. Going to be most excellent. Don't be jealous. Try to be most excellent. All right, let's look at how Lukacs starts. Happy are those ages when the starry sky is the map of all possible paths. Ages whose paths are illuminated by the light of the stars. Everything in such ages is new and yet familiar, full of adventure and yet their own. The world is wide and yet it is like a home. For the fire that burns in the soul is of the same essential nature as the stars. The world and the self, the light and the fire are sharply distinct, yet they never become permanent strangers to one another. For fire is the soul of all light, and all fire clothes itself in light. Thus each action of the soul becomes meaningful and rounded in this duality, complete in meaning, in sense, and complete for the senses. Rounded because the soul rests within itself even while it acts. Rounded because its action separates itself from it, and having become itself, finds a center of its own and draws a closed circumference round itself. Philosophy is really homesickness, says Novalis. It is the urge to be at home everywhere, but also the inability to do so. So notice philosophy is itself an indicator or a symptom of the loss of this happiness, the loss of this integration.
Is considering Novalis a poet?
He kind of tries to be. You mean like the Songs of the Night? No, it's lyric. It's lyric. Novalis is super lyrical. It's lyric. We had a little bit of Novalis that I put on the syllabus and had available to you guys to read, but we didn't look at it in class. But you know, he's a kind of romantic, you know, and in that way, of course, very lyrical.
What is the difference between lyric and
Epic. Lyric is about the voice of the individual. It's about the individual solo singer. It's the literal lyre. It's the lyre, you know. It's the song of the lyricist, the one who's plucking the lyre. Right. So it's not the chorus. That's actually something that I meant to bring up. So originally tragedy was all chorus, and then the protagonist emerges from the chorus, and then the chorus recedes, and then the chorus is kind of between the gods and the audience, and the protagonist, sort of in this other realm. But when it was all chorus, it is also the audience, which is also the gods.
Wait, why is the audience of God?
Because it's the moment of the Dionysian ritual, right? It is the religious ritual, it's the Dionysian sacrifice. And so everybody wears the mask of Dionysus, everyone participates in the loss of their individuality. It's the, it is the ritual Dionysian experience, which then becomes focused on the one sacrificial individual. This is recapitulated in the form of drama, which is that originally, Nietzsche thinks, what a drama is well, it's first of all musical. It's a musical drama. Music recedes from it. It's the chorus telling the epic story. Right, so what's the standpoint from which the epic story is told? Here's another way of thinking about it. Who wrote the Bible? God wrote the Bible. What are you talking about? It's the Word of God. Hello. And yet it's clearly the tribe wrote the Bible, right? It's the oral history of the tribe. But it's the Word of God. Right? The Old Testament. The New Testament is a novel with various authors, right? So you got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you got Paul, right? You got these different ones. So you have the different sort of testimonials, and yet they're all the Gospels, meaning what's gospel? They're all the Word of God, but they're the word of the apostles, but they're the Word of God. And they tell the story of Jesus as a character who's a man, but who's also God. Mm-hmm.
So doesn't that make the Bible both lyrical?
Right, but the Old Testament, you don't really have like authors in that way. Not even the Book of Psalms, I don't think, has authorship. You have characters, but you don't have authors. Right? It's the collective authorship, and it's also the collective readership. So the Old Testament has a readership that is collective. The Protestant Christian Bible is read by individuals. It's translated into the vernacular. You have it in your home. It's not something that's cracked open only at religious rituals and read aloud by a priest, but in a language that you may not understand. Right? So, again, the emergence of the individual from the collective, what is that? It's a problematical moment. Right? It's when the relation between the individual and the collective becomes problematical, such that the individual can emerge as such. But then that means that the collective has become problematical, which also means that the individual is problematical. Right? So it's not just a problem between the individual and the collective, but it's also within the collective and within the individual. And yet, that problematical character, it's almost impossible to think of art as anything but that. Right? Meaning, what is the point of art if it's not an experience that is posing a problem? So even when religious art, so-called, is experienced as art, it's only because we've taken it out of its context and or because the religion has become problematical in its meaning. And so we're looking at it aesthetically.
An integrated society, life itself would be aesthetic, right?
Yes, that's part of his point, but it's a curious point, right? It is a point. But let's continue with what he says here. So if philosophy is really homesickness, So it's the urge to be at home everywhere and yet being at home nowhere. It says that is why philosophy as a form of life, or as that which determines the form and supplies the content of literary creation, is always a symptom of the rift between inside and outside, a sign of the essential difference between the self and the world, and the incongruence of soul and deed. So if you remember from the genealogy of morals, the distinction between the doer and the deed, right, which is actually the achievement of the dimensional or deep character of the individual, in which you're considering your own action and its meaning, rather than simply inhabiting that action. Right? So here, the difference between soul and deed. Why? Because we try to redeem the individual from their action.
How would somebody be in the action? Like,
Good question.
or does it just like, you just don't feel, like it's like,
So
it's
the
my
no-
dog, the way my dog is.
Exactly. It is animalistic. It is. No, because this is why Nietzsche has his zoomorphisms, meaning why the noble is a bird of prey, where lightning and thunder are the same. Right? You can't separate the lightning from the flash. You can't separate the strike from the effect. You can't separate the doer and the deed. You can't blame the bird of prey for being a bird of prey. You can't ask the bird of prey to not be, to do something else, because if it did something else, then it would no longer be a bird of prey.
So, the lyricism, lyric and epic, it's just a question of point of view.
Did you say motivation?
No, it's just a question of point of view.
Well, I suppose. Well, what do you mean by point of view?
Well, if you say that for something to be epic, it's the main character of the story, but from his own point. But if there's an author, narrator that comes in, it becomes lyrical, because it's not the point of view of the main character, it's the point of view of the narrator.
And of the reader.
Yeah.
Right, so, but again, it has to do with the protagonist. So the protagonist is the exemplar of the community. In other words, he's not at odds with the community. So of course he can be at odds with the community. But at odds with the community in what way? Right, usually at odds with the gods. Right, in which case he stands in for the community's relationship to the gods. Right? This is the idea anyway. Meaning that, well, here's a Shakespeare reference, right? Shakespeare reference Hamlet, right? Hamlet's famous soliloquy, to be or not to be, that is the question. But what is that soliloquy about? It's actually about him being a prince and deciding what to do. And he can't really figure out what he should do, and that's why it's a question of his being. Right? Because he is a prince and therefore he has to do, but he doesn't want to and he's not sure. So it's not to be or not to be that is the question, it is to act or not act that is the question. And the uncertainty of action is the uncertainty of what he should do as the prince, meaning it's an uncertainty of his being. Right? Now, of course, if he was not a bourgeois individual, if it wasn't Shakespeare, if he was a real prince, he wouldn't have that soliloquy. He would just act. Right? So, again, when we're watching Shakespeare, we are watching with pity and fear, Aristotle's terms, Hamlet. We are watching the unfolding of a tragic fate, where his inability to act is the tragedy. But again, what is that? Right? Is that a story of human relations, human society? Is it, it does have this kind of cosmic significance. But it's located on the individual level. And, there are so many aspects of it, right? There was so many kind of tragic characters in that story also. In other words, that Hamlet Hamlet causes suffering not only to himself, but also those around him. And it's precisely around his role. Right? His inability to be himself. So, I raise that only because, okay, so the point of view, you could say that the very conception of epic literature that we have is from the standpoint of the novel. Right? Again, that we would read the epic as if it were a novel. It's hard for us to make sense of it otherwise. And yet, what's being posited here, in the same way that Nietzsche was positing, we have to imagine that there was a time when it was not the case, where the tragic character in a myth or in a stage drama tragedy is not a bourgeois subject, is not an individual that we're supposed to relate to as individuals, but is rather a more kind of collective figure.
What about like Dante's like he's the narrator, or not him, but like the guy who represents him, I think. Like, but it's also encounter just things. There is like I guess a structure because they're going through the layers, but you're also just kind of encountering all these other. Is it because there's like a central individual? Would that be a novel or not a novel?
That's what Lukacs thinks. So there are two works by Dante, right? There's the Inferno and then there's the Divine Comedy. Those are two different things, yes. So I just wanted to mention Divine Comedy because that is kind of an interesting contradiction in terms, right? So, yes, and again, it's emergent in the sense of, well, what is it? Is it an affirmation of religion? Is it a problematization of religious cosmology? Like, because again, is it a kind of humanistic translation of religion? In a way that's different but parallel to Raphael. Meaning, is he giving us like a religious allegory of the human? Right? Or is it a fully religious allegory? Right? It's ambiguous. But it does look like the emergence of a religious allegory for the human, as opposed to just strictly a religious allegory. Okay, this is why happy ages have no philosophy, or, it comes to the same thing, all men in such ages are philosophers, sharing the utopian aim of every philosophy. For what is the task of true philosophy if not to draw that archetypal map, right, where everything kind of makes sense, the whole world is integrated whole. What is the problem of the transcendental locus, if not to determine how every impulse which springs from the innermost depths is coordinated with a form that it is ignorant of, but that has been assigned to it from eternity and that must envelop it in liberating symbols? When this is so, passion is the way, predetermined by reason, towards complete self-being, and from madness come enigmatic yet decipherable messages of a transcendental power, otherwise condemned to silence. There is not yet any interiority, for there is not yet any exterior, any otherness for the soul. The soul goes out to seek adventure, it lives through adventures, but does not know the real torment of seeking and the real danger of finding. Such a soul never stakes itself. It does not yet know that it can lose itself. It never thinks of having to look for itself. Such an age is the age of the epic. So what he's setting up here is a bunch of kind of negative criteria for the novel. Right? So the epic doesn't do these things, but the novel will do. He says, it is not the absence of suffering, not security of being, which in such an age encloses man and deeds in contours that are both joyful and severe. For what is meaningless and tragic in the world has not grown larger since the beginning of time. It is only that the songs of comfort ring out more loudly or are more muffled. It is the adequacy of the deeds to the soul's inner demand for greatness, for unfolding, for wholeness, when the soul does not yet know any abyss within itself, which may tempt it to fall or encourage it to discover pathless heights. When the divinity that rules the world and distributes the unknown and unjust gifts of destiny is not yet understood by man, but is familiar and close to him, as a father is to his small child, then every action is only a well-fitting garment for the world. Being and destiny, adventure and accomplishment, life and essence are then identical concepts. For the question which engenders the formal answers of the epic is, how can life become essence? And if no one has ever equaled Homer, or even approached him, for strictly speaking his works alone are epics, it is because he found the answer before the progress of the human mind through history had allowed the question to be asked. This line of thought can, if we wish, take us some way towards understanding the secret of the Greek world, its perfection, which is unthinkable for us, and the unbridgeable gulf that separates us from it. The Greek knew only answers but no questions, only solutions, even if enigmatical ones, but no riddles, only forms but no chaos. He drew the creative circle of forms this side of paradox, and everything which in our time of paradox is bound to lead to triviality led him to perfection. When we speak of the Greeks, we always confuse the philosophy of history with aesthetics, psychology with metaphysics, and we invent a relationship between Greek forms and our own epoch. Behind those taciturn, now forever silent masks, sensitive souls look for the fugitive, elusive moments which they themselves have dreamed of peace, forgetting that the value of those moments is in their very transience, and that what they seek to escape from when they turn to the Greeks constitutes their own depth and greatness. All right, so again, the idea is that we only, it's kind of paradoxical, isn't it? We only look to like integrated civilization as a model of perfection because we're motivated to do so out of our own problematic condition and nature. So again, the dialectic here is important, right? So even though these things are contradictory, they're dialectically constituted, but in a way that's ultimately integrated and reconciled. I'll skip some of the insanity, although I do love this one. More profound minds who try to forge an armor of purple steel out of their own streaming blood, so that their wounds may be concealed forever, and their heroic gesture may become a paradigm of the real heroism that is to come, so that it may call the new heroism into being. Compare the fragmentariness of the forms they create with the Greeks' harmony, and their own sufferings from which their forms have sprung, with torments which they imagine the Greeks' purity to have overcome. Interpreting formal perfection in their obstinately solipsistic way as a function of inner devastation, they hope to hear in the Greek words the voice of a torment whose intensity exceeds theirs by as much as Greek art is greater than their own. Yet this is a complete reversal of the transcendental topography of the mind, that topography whose nature and consequences can certainly be described, whose metaphysical significance can be interpreted and grasped, but for which it will always be impossible to find a psychology, whether of empathy or of mere understanding. For all psychological comprehension presupposes a certain position of the transcendental loci and functions only within their range. Instead of trying to understand the Greek world in this way, which in the end comes to asking unconsciously, what could we do to produce these forms, or how would we behave if we had produced these forms? It would be more fruitful to inquire into the transcendental topography of the Greek mind, which was essentially different from ours, and which made those forms possible and even necessary. So what he's saying here is that, of course, our forms, we have to inquire into the possibility and necessity of our forms, even if our forms are problematic. Laying all this out just because the parallels to Nietzsche, and especially to the birth of tragedy, is what we have to sort of connect up here. All right, I guess let's take a short break, and then we can come back and look at the notes that you guys posted. All right, let's resume. So I promised an introduction to Marxism, so let's do that a little bit. Because it does flow out of what we were just talking about. So the little passage I like to use to describe Marxism, written by a present-day contemporary intellectual historian, also a kind of cultural critic and commentator, including a commentator on politics, Louis Menand. And he writes for the New York Times and the New Yorker, and I think he's a professor at Columbia University. He wrote the introduction to a book that was republished around the time I started teaching here at SAIC, 2003. That was originally published in 1940, and that book is by Edmund Wilson. It's called To the Finland Station, an essay on the writing and acting of history. It's a history of socialism from the French Revolution to the Russian Revolution. So that title, To the Finland Station, refers to the train station in St. Petersburg that Lenin arrived at in 1917 when he returned from exile to lead the revolution. So when they republished the book in 2003, they got this guy Menand to write an introduction situating the book and also talking about Wilson, Edmund Wilson, as a character. So he was he's one of the New York intellectuals. He's a intellectual fellow traveler of the communist movement in the 1930s, who then turned against communism later. So let's see what Louis Menand has to say about Marxism, or at least about what Marxists of Edmund Wilson's time in the 1930s believed, or how they saw things. All right, so in pre-modern societies, this is Menand, the ends of life are given at the beginning of life. People do things in their generation, so that the same things will continue to be done in the next generation. Meaning is immanent in all the ordinary customs and practices of existence, since these are inherited from the past and are therefore worth reproducing. The idea is to make the world go not forward, only around. In modern societies, by contrast, the ends of life are not given at the beginning of life. They are thought to be created or discovered. The reproduction of the customs and practices of the group is no longer the chief purpose of existence. The idea is not to repeat, but to change, to move the world forward. Meaning is therefore no longer immanent in the practices of ordinary life, since those practices are understood by everyone to be contingent and time-bound. This is why death, in modern societies, is the great taboo and absurdity, the worst thing one can imagine. For at the close of life, people cannot look back and know that they have accomplished the task set for them at birth. This knowledge always lies up ahead, somewhere over history's horizon. Modern societies don't know what will count as valuable in the conduct of life in the long run, because they have no way of knowing what conduct the long run will find itself in a position to respect. The only certain knowledge death comes with is the knowledge that the values of one's own time, the values one has tried to live by, are expungible. Marxism gave a meaning to modernity. It said that, wittingly or not, the individual performs a role in a drama that has a shape and a goal, a trajectory, and that modernity will turn out to be just one act in that drama. Historical change is not arbitrary. It is generated by class conflict. It is faithful to an inner logic. It points toward an end, which is the establishment of the classless society. Marxism was founded on an appeal for social justice, but there were many forms that such an appeal might have taken. Its deeper attraction was the discovery of meaning, a meaning in which human beings might participate in history itself. When Edmund Wilson explained in his introduction to the 1972 edition of To the Finland Station that his book had been written under the assumption that, quote, an important step in progress has been made, that a fundamental breakthrough had occurred. This is the truth he was referring to, that Marx and Engels were the philosophers of a second enlightenment. So, what does second enlightenment mean? So, first enlightenment would be bourgeois enlightenment. It would be the enlightenment that starts with the Renaissance and culminates in the 1700s. In Marx's time, in the 1800s, why is there a need for a second enlightenment? Because capitalism might be incomprehensible or not really graspable from the standpoint of bourgeois enlightenment. So a new enlightenment was necessary in the 19th century. Right, there was a new problem to become enlightened about. Capitalism. So bourgeois society became problematical in the 1800s, and therefore a second enlightenment was needed to try to understand and overcome that problem. Right. I also provided for you guys to hear it from the horse's mouth, Marx himself. A similar formulation, but written in the kind of crazy Hegelian language that is Marx. The ancient conception in which man always appears in however narrowly national, religious, or political a definition as the aim of production seems very much more exalted than the modern world, in which production is the aim of man and wealth the aim of production. So means and ends have a different relationship. So what Menand was saying about the ends of life being given at the beginning of life, no. Now the end of life is actually the means, production itself. So production used to be a means, a culture engaged in production with a definite end in mind, with a definite goal in mind, reproducing its own form of life, reproducing its own culture. Now, production, the means, has become an end in itself. He says, in fact, however, when the narrow bourgeois form has been peeled away, what is wealth, if not the universality of needs, capacities, enjoyments, productive powers, etc., of individuals, produced in universal exchange? What, if not the full development of human control over the forces of nature, those of his own nature as well as those of so-called nature? What, if not the absolute elaboration of his creative dispositions without any preconditions other than antecedent historical evolution, which make the totality of this evolution, the evolution of all human powers as such, unmeasured by any previously established yardstick, an end in itself? What is this, if not a situation where man does not reproduce in any determined form, but produces his totality, where he does not seek to remain something formed by the past, but is in the absolute movement of becoming? In bourgeois political economy, and in the epoch of production to which it corresponds, this complete elaboration of what lies within man appears as the total alienation, and the destruction of all fixed one-sided purposes as the sacrifice of the end in itself to a wholly external compulsion. Hence, in one way, the childlike world of the ancients appears to be superior, and this is so, insofar as we seek for closed shape, form, and established limitation. the ancients provided narrow satisfaction, whereas the modern world leaves us unsatisfied, or where it appears to be satisfied with itself, pardon me, is vulgar and mean. So, again, the modern world, unsatisfied, problematical, to use Lukacs' language. But then the question is, what's the nature of that problem? Where is this problem coming from? So again, a kind of a rupture of means and ends. They're no longer integrated and reconciled, but they're kind of opposed. One of the effects of that is the reversal, in which the means becomes an end in itself. However, that's also freedom. So the absolute movement of becoming, it's freedom. So we're unsatisfied, but that's because we're free. Meaning, we might have a nostalgia for the integrated civilizations or for the happy ages in which everything is reconciled. But our condition is problematical because it's a condition of freedom. And that leaves us unsatisfied. And where we try to sort of avoid that dissatisfaction, we end up with a kind of vulgar and mean version of the same. So, right, not seeking to remain something formed by the past in the absolute movement of becoming. Now finally, there's another text that I provided for you guys that's also illustrative, and that's by Peter Proust, who's a scholar of philosophy, who's writing on an essay of Nietzsche's. We did Nietzsche last time. Nietzsche on history. So Nietzsche's use and abuse of history for life, also called Advantage and Disadvantage of History for Life. It's an early Nietzsche. It's from the same time as The Birth of Tragedy and also the Truth and Lie in an Extramoral Sense that we looked at. So here's Peter Proust summarizing Nietzsche and how Nietzsche fits into the larger condition of the 1800s and the 19th century. Here's Proust. Man, unlike animal, is self-conscious. He is aware that he is alive and that he must die. And because he is self-conscious, he is not only aware of living, but of living well or badly. Life is not wholly something that happens to man. It is also something he engages in according to values he follows. Human existence is a task. Whatever a person does finally receives its meaning only so far as it is integrated into the total task of existing. If it fails to further this task, it is worthless, valueless, If it hinders this task, it is to be rejected. The quest for knowledge and truth is also a part of the task of existing. And like every human enterprise, it receives its value from being integrated into the task of which it is a part. The 19th century had discovered history, and all subsequent inquiry and education bore the stamp of this discovery. This was not simply the discovery of a set of facts about the past, but the discovery of the historicity of man. Man, unlike animal, is a historical being. Man is not wholly the product of an alien act, either natural or divine, but in part, at least, produces his own being. The task of existing is a task precisely because it is not a case of acting according to a permanent nature or essence, but rather of producing that nature within the limitations of a situation. History is the record of this self-production. It is the activity of a historical being recovering the past into the present, which anticipates the future. With the total absence of this activity, man would fall short of humanity. History is necessary. What if this activity is perverted? What if rather than remaining the life-promoting activity of a historical being, history is turned into the objective uncovering of mere facts by the disinterested scholar, facts to be left as they are found, to be contemplated without being assimilated into present being? According to Nietzsche, this perversion has taken place. and history, rather than promoting life, has become deadly. This then is the dilemma Nietzsche faced. History is necessary, but as it is practiced, it is deadly. The present work is an attempt to extricate himself and us from this dilemma. So here's Nietzsche's own, again, out of the horse's own mouth, from the essay in question. Here's Nietzsche. A person must have the power and from time to time use it to break a past and dissolve it in order to be able to live. Here it is not righteousness which sits in the judgment seat, or even less mercy which announces judgment, but life alone, that dark, driving, insatiable, self-desiring force. People or ages serving life in this way by judging and destroying a past are always dangerous and in danger. It is an attempt to give oneself, as it were, a past after the fact, out of which we may be descended, in opposition to the one from which we are descended. It is always a dangerous attempt, because it is so difficult to find a borderline to the denial of the past, and because the second nature usually is weaker than the first. So again, that kind of self-overcoming that we had in the genealogy of morals. We could also say, this is actually his description of what he called critical history, that this is the condition that people are in terms of the meaning of the past relative to their own present meaning as problematical. Right, so it's when the relationship between past and present is problematical that we're faced with this task of destroying and dissolving a past in order to create a new past from which we may be descended in opposition to the one from which we are descended. It's when history becomes a site of struggle. Now, of course, what's being described here, both in the Menand and in Marx, as well as in the Nietzsche, is traditional civilization. So the integrated civilizations that Lukacs is characterizing. The civilizations of the epic are traditional civilizations. Right? Meaning, we could say art and life are integrated. Art and life are integrated because the values of both are clear. Right? The relationship between art and life is not problematical because the values of life and the values of art are harmonious and also not problematical either in themselves nor in relation to one another. So again, the novel form is, he thinks, a phenomenon of that separation of art and life in which both become problematical. Right? So art separates itself from life because life becomes problematical, and therefore art becomes problematical. One of the symptoms of that is the separation of art and life. So we could also say the half art and art character of the novel has to do with the relationship between art and life. Right, so the disintegration of art and life. So what we were talking about earlier, in light of history, epic literature is inseparable from history. Right? The separation of history from narrative art, history from literature, would itself be a symptom of this disintegration. Right? Where literature appears to be subjective and history, historiography, seems to be objective. Right? So again, here, again, Nietzsche's quite romantic, the early Nietzsche is quite romantic in this respect, that historicism, or a kind of objective history, would be a symptom of a crisis of meaning. Right, where you're treating the facts of the past as if they are objective, whereas if they were integrated, the facts of the past would have meaning, there would be no separation of subjective and objective, there would be no separation of art and life, there would be no separation of history and literature. That's the idea. Whereas it is for us. Right? So again, the fact that we would treat epic literature as holistic in a way that the novel is problematical is itself a symptom. Right? Because we treat it as like holistic in terms of an aesthetic wholeness. We treat it as holistic as art. But really what we're trying to discover there is the holistic integration of life. All right. Let's see what you guys posted here. So we have Brianna and we have Elin. All right. Is Elin here? Or not here? Not here. Hold on. Do I get an email? I did. Or did I not? No. I got it. Ah, I did. Okay. Terrible. All right, let's talk about totality. Let's talk about that category of totality. So totality, when we hear the word totality, this concept of totality immediately suggests, again, something holistic, whole, integrated, reconciled. But what if it's a totality? What if the totality is a totality of contradiction? What if it's a totality of disintegration? What if it's a problematical totality or an unreconciled totality? Right, so again, the epic can appear to be a totality that emerges from a social and even cosmological, like a civilizational or even a cosmological totality, a spiritual totality. But by contrast with what? With our totality. So what does it mean to call something a totality that is disintegrated, unreconciled, contradictory? Right, so it's a totality of contradiction. Right, so it's the problematical itself that characterizes the totality. So the novel is a totality, but it's a totality of contradiction. It's a totality of a problematical existence, which might project back from it a relatively unproblematical form. The reason I say that is that, well, who's to say that the epic form isn't itself a totality of contradiction, or a totality of lack of reconciliation, a totality of disintegration? But from the standpoint of the novel, it appears the opposite of that. It appears, by contrast, to be the opposite of that. So, in the passage that we read, in terms of pointing beyond, or a transcendental locus, or transcendental loci, plural of locus, that it's not pointing to a higher reality yet to be achieved, but is itself embodying that reality. So to say that it's problematical or contradictory or unreconciled or disintegrated means that it's actually pointing beyond itself to something else. It's pointing to a self-transformation beyond itself. So in this sense, internal, external, interior, exterior, problematical self pointing to a transcendental transformation, right? That is the totality. That's the totality of the novel form. So it's a new way, we could say, of attempting a reconciliation. That by contrast, the prior epic form seems to have achieved. But maybe in its own time, the epic form was itself the expression of a striving rather than an achievement. I say that only because he's trying to see the novel in his own time, and he's trying to point to a history of its own emergence and its own self-transformations. Right, so the origin of the novel, we could say, comes out of a self-contradiction in Christianity, in the Renaissance. Right, so it comes out of Christianity becoming problematical, in the same way that Christianity itself came out of ancient Mediterranean civilization becoming problematical. So here's another way of thinking about totality. This is just all right. Form and content. Form and content. So totality would mean no division, no separation, no contradiction in form and content. But what if the relationship between form and content, what if their integral relation is actually a relation of contradiction? Well, for instance, what we were talking about with Raphael, I'll use that as another example. Which is to say, is there some contradiction present between its religious and its secular content, or between its theological and its humanistic content? Right, the transfiguration, Jesus rising, the boy having an epileptic fit. So Jesus becoming himself, transcending himself, and thereby becoming himself, and the boy becoming himself by losing himself, disintegrating, falling apart. All right, so again, totality, it sounds like its very concept is one of reconciliation, but it can also be a totality of contradiction. Okay, so this is a good quotation from page 41. That tragedy, although changed, has nevertheless survived in our time, with its essential nature intact, whereas the epic had to disappear and yield its place to an entirely new form, the novel. So, again, tragedy has been reinvented, but the epic form hasn't come full circle. So, the epic appears to be synonymous with life, whereas the novel appears to be the divorce from life. Move on to our second set of notes. Are we also missing? What happened, children? Did I get a RSVP? Or did I not? No? So what happened? People posted their notes and then they like collapsed. Is it epic like that? All right, so again, the novel is characterized by its secular character, its secular reality, meaning it is clearly of its own time. And it embraces the contradiction of life, the contradictions within life. So the question is whether the novel is the product of capitalism. It both is and it isn't. It depends on how we define capitalism. If we basically say, like Max Weber did, that modern capitalism, as opposed to ancient capitalism, begins in the Renaissance, then of course the novel is the product of capitalism. If we distinguish between bourgeois society and capitalism, which is what Marx specifying capitalism as a product of the Industrial Revolution, then there would be the novel in its two different forms. There's the novel in its emergence and its achievement, and then there's the novel in its crisis and disintegration. So there's the bourgeois novel, and then there's the modernist novel. And the question is whether the modernist novel is a novel anymore. So in order to preserve itself, the novel form has to try to reinvent itself. And the question is whether it had done so successfully or not. You know, it is interesting that Lukacs finishes his book with a sense of, you know, we're already beyond the novel. It's unclear what's coming next, but we're seeing some intimations of it in Dostoevsky. All right, so I think that we did the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena, did we? Have we done that in this class, or have we not? Do we do it with Hegel? Maybe, or maybe not. We might have, we might have not. Let me see if I... Well, maybe not. Okay. All right, so let's look at this. Oops, maybe not. So we have done being and becoming. Did we not do? Familiar or unfamiliar? You're in more than one class, that's the problem.
No, I trust me, I remember.
We have done it?
Yeah.
All right, so appearance and essence, right? So the question of essence, right? So the ancient idea, which is common to both philosophy and religion, is that the world of appearances is deceptive and therefore deceives us as to the true essence of things. Right? So there's a contradiction between appearance and essence. Essences are true, appearances are false or deceptive. Now, interestingly, when we think about it as integrated civilization and reconciled forms, then appearance and essence would be harmonious. I mentioned Lukacs is a neo-Hegelian in the theory of the novel. So he is trying to follow from Hegel that the essence must appear. That's Hegel's famous phrase, the essence must appear. Meaning, appearances are not merely deceptive or false or epiphenomenal, but appearances are indeed essential. Even when, perhaps especially when, the appearance seems to contradict the essence. Because then what that means is that the essence is itself contradictory. Right? So the contradiction of appearance and essence would register an appearance. You'd have contradictory appearances, and that would express a contradictory essence. So, what's the phrase, life becoming essence? Life becoming essence? What that means is that the essence is always something that becomes rather than merely already being what is. Right, so when we think about soul and deed, acting, right, in an integrated nature, one becomes what one is through acting, through consequential action. Really what we're talking about is the dialectic of appearance and essence. Meaning, where essence and appearance seem to be in contradiction, it's not that the essence is true and the appearance is false. It could in fact be that the appearance is true and that the contradiction with essence means that the essence is false. But what would that mean? It means that the essence is in a process of transformation. In other words, the essence is false as it is, but is becoming true.
I think we did mention this, but in more of the religion, art, and philosophy. We didn't talk about that in the course. Well, we did, but it's just more focused.
So another term that we have to put in there is form. Right, this is crucial for Lukacs' theory of the novel. So forms of appearance. Forms of appearance, forms of essence. Forms of appearance. With what form does essence appear? Are the forms of appearance true? Is the form of appearance itself essential? So, forms of appearance as not accidental or arbitrary or potentially mistaken or deceptive, but as necessary. The way things appear to us is necessarily so and expresses a necessity. So, necessary forms of appearance, the essence must appear with necessity, are also the forms of appearance of necessity. But what is necessity in this case? So if you remember from Kant, concepts of nature and the concept of freedom. The dialectic of nature and freedom, dialectic of necessity and freedom. So concepts of nature express necessity, but there's a higher necessity, namely to overcome necessity, to transform necessity. And it's the transformation of necessity that is freedom. So appearance doesn't just tell us the way the world is, it also tells us what it must become, how it must be changed, how it must transform itself. But how? Again, that's where the appearance might be problematical. The appearance itself might be problematical. So what we have here, the catchphrase is the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena. So phenomena, I think that we talked about Erscheinung. Starting with Kant. Erscheinung can be translated variously as phenomenon, appearance, semblance. So we have these different words in English, but it's one word in German, Erscheinung. So phenomena, phenomenal expressions, phenomenal manifestations, phenomenal appearances, phenomena. Expressions of what? Pathology. Expressions of suffering. Suffering from what? Suffering from a task. Suffering from a condition of freedom that must be changed. A task of freedom. So the necessity with which the world appears to us, as it does, is actually telling us how things need to be changed. So in traditional civilization, we could say appearances tell us the way things are, and there's no separation of what is and what ought to be. There's no separation of being and becoming. When things are problematical, then being and becoming appear contradictory. Necessity is not a necessity for the way the world is, but it's the necessity of changing it. But how do we know? In other words, how is that actually indicated? So it's indicated, again, as pathological expression. It's indicated as symptomatic. So again, symptom. I think that Lukacs says philosophy is a symptom. When philosophy arrives on the scene, it's a symptom. Meaning, when everyone's a philosopher, no one's a philosopher, and philosophy is integrated into life, and so there is no philosophy as such. When philosophy emerges, it's because there's a problem, and it's because it's a problem, it's an expression of suffering. So phenomena, even philosophy itself is a phenomenon. The appearance of philosophy on the scene at a historical moment is a symptom. Phenomena have a symptomatic character, but they also diagnose themselves. So when we think of philosophy, like Aristotle's philosophy of tragedy being a symptom of the death of tragedy, birth of philosophy is the emergence of a problem in the integrated civilization in which it's no longer reconciled. But it also diagnoses itself. Meaning, of course, philosophy is there to pose the question, to try to inquire into the nature of the problem. It tries to diagnose things. It doesn't only express suffering, but tries to diagnose it. What's the reason for it? And it also reaches beyond itself, it points beyond itself. It has a prognostical character. So it indicates where things might be going. Right, so if things are becoming problematical, they're not meant to just remain there, but meant to go beyond that condition. That's what critique is. You could say philosophy is born of critique. It's born of a possibility. Possibility for transformation. And that's indicated not from outside the phenomenon, but from within the phenomenon. Not from outside the form of life, but from within the form of life. How is it expressed? When that form of life, including its phenomenal expressions, appear contradictory. So the appearance of contradiction shows the possibility and necessity for change. Possibility and necessity for transformation.
Here's the whole point about abstract idealism and then romantic disillusionment, right? That both try and reconcile the contradiction in their own ways. Yeah.
So what's the example of the novel of abstract idealism?
Is it Goethe? No, Goethe's in between. Goethe's
Right.
the mediator. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Not the novel, but how is it characterized? Like, what does it look like?
Oh, just like the individual who's obsessed with the ideal of what should be, it's kind of demonic in that way, that they just have to act because they want to realize the ideal in the world. Whereas the romantic disillusionment is a kind of resignation, a kind of interiorization of the ideal. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. So, right, the novel of abstract idealism is the novel of the striving after the ideal, whereas the novel of romantic disillusionment is the novel of the impossibility of the ideal. Right. Yeah, Goethe is the sort of middle term between those two. Right. So, it's this sort of realization of the ideal.
Yeah, it's recognizing like that one has to accommodate to the real to realize the ideal. So it's mediating between interiority and the external.
Right. So let's talk about that. Okay. So that's a good way of thinking about it. So external and internal would also be the contradiction of the real and the ideal. So the novel of abstract idealism is like the novel of the conflict between the person and the world. Right, that's the character of the heroism. All right, so that's the other point we could say, is that the meaning of the novel is the meaning of the search for meaning. Right, so the meaning of the epic is the self-evident meaning of the things that happen in the world that exists. The meaning of the novel is the search for meaning in otherwise the absence of meaning in the way the world exists. And in the actions of the protagonist. Another way of putting it is that the epic hero has no interiority. Right? Even when there is an inner struggle, there isn't an interiority because there's no divorce between internal and external. Yeah, did we talk about irony?
Yeah.
Talk about irony. I'm not sure that we covered it, but let's come full circle on that, especially with regard to Lukacs as a Hegelian. And really looking at modernity in the novel form primarily through Romanticism. And so Hegel thought that irony was the form of self-recognition, but also misrecognition of the romantic. Romantic irony. What is this? Recall that Hegel thought irony was a necessary symptom, but it was also an inadequate self-understanding, because to be ironical about forming content, do we have forming content? Yes. To be ironical about art would also mean being ironical about life. Right, so if art becomes too self-ironical, what that's ultimately a symptom of, but also a kind of resignation to a self-ironization of life itself, which can seem like a dead end, but is actually calling for an overcoming, a transformation. Now again, irony emerges in history at certain times. You could say that by comparison with the epic, the novel is inherently ironical. And yet that irony can show up in different ways. So,
It's still.
Go ahead.
It's still about potentials. It's still about possibilities. We still can't pinpoint. We can't say that being ironic just means that it's only condition or pre.
Right, so if you recall Hegel, his criticism of irony, or the irony, is that it yearns for an earlier form that would appear by contrast to be non-ironical, and therefore it takes its condition to be a loss of meaning, whereas actually it's a new meaning. And that's really Lukacs' point here. That you could treat the novel as a symptom of the loss of meaning of epic literature, of narrative art, or you could see it as the new meaning. Not the loss of meaning, but the new meaning. Part of the problem here, again, it's recapitulating the way Hegel posed things. Although Hegel really is living before modernism per se, but modernism is an outgrowth of Romanticism. But here, Lukacs is identifying a kind of modernist moment with a romantic moment. I think that we would experience the modernist novel as inherently ironical. I pointed to Joyce, the portrait of the artist as a young man. Right? That would be something that we would associate with a kind of ironization of both life and the form itself.
Can this be categorized as tautology?
As a tautology?
Yeah.
What would the tautology be?
I mean, it itself, well, it is the novel
What is it, tautology?
where,
Kind of a self-evident truth, like a truism.
but then you get into a vicious cycle just trying to explain it because the only meaning is in itself. Does that make sense? That's why I thought just because the irony is built within itself, so you cannot really.
Is it treated as an endpoint, or is it treated as a potential new beginning? Right, that's really the issue. In other words, is landing in irony, right? Does it cast then behind it historically? Oh, life has always been ironical. Art has always been ironical. It's always been a mere form. Right? That's one danger. The other, of course, is that it will always be that.
Do we just accept this then?
Right. So as opposed to irony being an expression of a task.
I mean, the romantic idea of irony is self-detachment, right?
Mhm.
So it's actually an expression of the objectification of oneself, and the fact that you can detach yourself from yourself.
Is the, like, idea that being childlike, is that at all, like, influenced by Freud and, like, kind of the development of the, you know, the child, like, not being, separate from the world at first, and looking at
It might be. I mean, so Lukacs was not influenced by Freud because he probably wouldn't have read Freud yet by the time he's writing this.
like,
However, Freud's living in the same era as Lukacs, right? So this era of the high modernist moment, the Gilded Age, Belle Epoque, Wilhelmine, Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm. That period it's Lukacs' period, it's also Freud's period, right? So Freudian psychoanalysis is making its discoveries at this historical moment, before World War I, right? So they're contemporaries. So what I'd say is that Freud might be describing in psychology something that Lukacs is describing through literature.
all it means it's true.
Might be, right? In other words, if we see these resonances, it's kind of like, oh, it seems like people are observing the same thing. However, you know, in different ways, from different vantage points and through different objects, through different phenomena.
Yeah,
Through
it's
different phenomena.
interesting that like the same kind of phenomena. I mean, this is like obvious and like happens all the time, but it's so kind of interesting that it like repeats, or it's like mimetic in like such different forms, where it's like that kind of very briefly makes it feel like the distinction between like inside and outside is a little bit disintegrated, because it's like, oh, my brain is working just the same way everything else is working. Like, it's just, you know, not so definite.
So that's self-alienation, you know, that Lukacs is talking about. It's thematized in the novel, but then the novel is also the story of like a kind of, it's a self-estrangement that then reconciles itself, you know, is overcome. Now, again, one could see that as a loss of meaning, or one could see it as like a possibility of a new meaning emerging. Right, so that's the ambivalent character of not just the novel form, but the problematical civilization out of which it emerges. So the main point here is that this is not simply a matter of literary history or art history, but it's a matter of life, of real history.
Lukacs really didn't like the abstraction, like, I like, my friend was reading an interview, like, or not a read, like a discussion, I think it was Brecht and Lukacs were like debating about abstract art, and it's the worst.
That's the later Lukacs.
Yeah, it's the 30s though.
Yeah.
It's the 30s. It's the later, yeah, it is the later Lukacs. Well, right. So he sort of steps away from what he's doing here. What he's doing here is trying to show the legitimacy, right, or the authenticity of problematical forms. Right. So, I mean, abstraction tends to be used pejoratively, right? Even what you were talking about, the novel of abstract idealism. It is like a kind of a, like a pejorative, negative connotation word. However, even there, one would have to see the need for it, the necessity of it. So it's not a matter of like discriminating between good art and bad art. I mean, this is why Adorno criticizes the later Lukacs for not seeing the legitimacy of a kind of a late modernism, or relating only ambivalently to the legitimacy of the high modernism. Right? But the abstraction that we think of when we think of abstract art is much more 20th century. Right? You know, you can see elements of it in the art and literature of the late 19th and very early 20th century, but it really comes into its own in the 20th century.
So they were talking about like novels and theater and probably like not painting.
Not what?
Not like painted, not like the plastic art.
Oh no, the plastic arts, I'm sure Lukacs didn't like that either. I'm sure he didn't like that either. Abstraction in the visual arts. Right. Right, because yeah, we can leave that aside for now. We'll come back to it with Adorno, because Adorno will be criticizing socialist realism as a kind of imperative, as an official kind of style, or an official aesthetic criterion for Soviet art, or for art, you know, as judged by the communist movement in the 20th century. So it's going to be a matter of modernism versus realism, or modernism versus socialist realism. And the issue, therefore, is going to be the legitimacy of modernism. In other words, the modernism is not just a failure, but is actually expressing something real. All right, I'll say one last thing since it comes up in the notes on melancholy. All right, so the melancholic would be apparently the opposite of the heroic. Right. We could also say, to use Omer's two classifications, there's the heroism of the novel of abstract idealism, there's the melancholy of the novel of romantic disillusionment. But again, the question is understanding that melancholy. Where does it come from, and what does it indicate? Is it an endpoint, or it does it point beyond itself? All right, so next time when we do Adorno's Lyric Poetry in Society, we will actually return to some of the passages in the theory of the novel. We'll look at specifically what Lukacs says about lyric poetry in the theory of the novel as the starting off point for Adorno's Lyric Poetry in Society. But maybe right before we end today, let's look at the very end of the theory of the novel. The world is the sphere of pure soul reality in which man exists as man, neither as a social being nor as an isolated, unique, pure, and therefore abstract interiority. If ever this world should come into being as something natural and simply experienced, as the only true reality, a new, complete totality could be built out of all its substances and relationships. It would be a world to which our divided reality would be a mere backdrop, a world which would have outstripped our dual world of social reality by as much as we have outstripped the world of nature. But art can never be the agent of such a transformation. The great epic is a form bound to the historical moment, and any attempt to depict the utopian as existent can only end in destroying the form, not in creating reality. The novel is the form of the epoch of absolute sinfulness, as Fichte said. That's a thinker between Kant and Hegel's time. And it must remain the dominant form so long as the world is ruled by the same stars. In Tolstoy, intimations of a breakthrough into a new epoch are visible, but they remain polemical, nostalgic, and abstract. It is in the words of Dostoevsky that this new world, remote from any struggle against what actually exists, is drawn for the first time simply as a seen reality. That is why he and the form he created lie outside the scope of this book. Dostoevsky did not write novels, and the creative vision revealed in his works has nothing to do either as affirmation or as rejection with European 19th century Romanticism, or with the many likewise romantic reactions against it. He belongs to the New World. Only formal analysis of his works can show whether he is already the Homer or the Dante of that world, or whether he merely supplies the songs which, together with the songs of other forerunners, later artists will one day weave into a great unity, whether he is merely a beginning or already a completion. It will then be the task of historico-philosophical interpretation to decide whether we are really about to leave the age of absolute sinfulness, or whether the new has no other herald but our hopes. Those hopes which are signs of a world to come, still so weak that it can easily be crushed by the sterile power of the merely extant, the merely existent. So, we've just lived through a similar period historically, namely postmodernism. In other words, was postmodernism the herald of something new, or was it already the achievement of it, or was it merely a hope for it? And what happened? What happened to it? Was it crushed by the sterile power of the merely existent? Right? Because there was a radical moment in the last 50 or 60 years. There was. But it does seem to be past now. And so what happened to it? All right, see you guys next week.